Hello, hello.
Hey there.
Hello. Here they come, here they come.
Hi, Ron. Hi to everyone. I think Ron's moderating.
Oh, horrors.
Ah,
All right. Can you gentlemen see me?
Yeah.
Oh, not
Yes.
yet.
not yet.
Oh, no, yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. Do I have to enable some?
Yeah,
Thing
bottom,
here.
bottom left. I did the same thing.
Start video.
There you
There I
are.
am, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, there's Wayne. In his
Hi,
dark
David.
study.
Yeah. it's Illich's
Is-
candle burning, giving all the light.
Well, how have you lost power?
No.
Oh, okay.
It's just that I have a little spotlight when this turns on that I don't want to adjust, and it overexposes the face, so I just turn it off.
Oh, yeah, nice. You look good by candlelight.
There you go. So do you. Thank you.
All right,
Good Zoom
I gotta
lighting.
get adjusted here. So I'm not too close there. That's better. Okay, who else is on board?
All right. Sure.
Hi.
Hi, David.
Hello. You are there.
I am there.
What happened?
The prof I was going to meet, she backed off. She had to read shirk applications or something, so she dematerialized.
Excellent.
Good.
I'd much
Good.
rather listen to you anyway.
Did you, Jens, while I've got you here, did you send that paper of Bruce Heinmarsh to
Yes.
all of this gang?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Oh no, I didn't. Only to you. I shall do.
I have it too.
Yeah. So if you could pass on the link, we can do that. I talked with Bruce this morning, and he was very what's a good word? I'm not good with words. Flattered, appreciative of your sending his
Oh,
regards
good.
and being impressed
Good.
with his work. Yeah. So
Yeah,
thanks.
it's an excellent thing he's done, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, I think so. He's getting a pass. He says he gets a letter from a pastor a day of appreciation and like to have a level-headed, thorough assessment of the thing, because a lot of them have sort of had thoughts, but they haven't really been able to put things together. So I
Okay,
think-
if for
What's
the
this
others,
about? Sorry.
this is a paper done by Jens's colleague Bruce Heinmarsh, published under the auspices of the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, an essay of some 70 pages, very, very thoroughly documented, which reviews all the issues in the pandemic critically, but in a very measured way. And it's just a superb piece of work, and obviously a great labor of love for him, since that
yes.
can't have been, yeah.
Yeah, he's had some personal investment there. So I think that made him look at the issues very thoroughly. Yeah.
So shall I forward it on to this group then afterwards?
I think, Catherine, you gave a link, didn't you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, you've done so already.
Oh, is it in the chat? Ah, yes.
Yes.
Oh, you guys are so sophisticated.
That's
I'm
Catherine.
so impressed. I bet you could have done it too, Wayne.
Okay, well, anyway, happy to be here. I'm gonna just have my picture going because I haven't had lunch yet, so the body does demand its due.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Later.
Well, maybe we should get going. I don't think we have to do introductions today because everyone who is with us has already introduced one another. So there's a couple of options. We could, as we did the last time, David, you could give us a brief overview of the chapters we read. I also have one little question that may help us bridge or make the transition. You say in page 93, where it says, I don't think one should draw too hard and fast a line between the churchmen of the 1950s and 60s and the public intellectuals of the 70s and the 80s.
said
We
that.
seem to be making that transition at that point. I don't know whether you want to look at continuity and change or just maybe reflect with us on the chapters we read.
I'm not denying that I wrote that sentence, but what's the context?
Oh,
It's a
yeah,
book. It's a big book.
I had to get rid of that. It was too big. No, in what context is that said?
Yeah, the context is one in which throughout the 50s and 60s, Illich was a little more explicitly engaged with the life of the church.
Oh, you mean Illich as I misheard it. Illich as churchmen rather
Yeah.
than churchmen in general
Yes, yeah.
compared to intellectuals. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Okay, that's a very good starting point. Yeah.
And
Okay.
just before we jump in, there's a technical question, David. Catherine was asked, are you still just seeing one speaker at a time on your screen?
Yeah, but I know how to fix that.
You know how to fix that now.
Yeah, I'm not
You know
that
about
skilled.
gallery view.
I've worked it out. But
Okay.
I like to see the individual
You like
because
to
everybody's
have
so tiny otherwise, right? If I
all
get
right.
the,
So you
but I
like
can't put
the-
up I can't put up the checkerboard if I want to. I know how.
Okay, very good.
Thank you. So I want to ask one or more questions first, which is, Ron, what's going on there today in Abbotsford?
Well, we have another atmospheric river. Hopefully it's the last of a series of about 5 of them now. So it means the Sumas Flats is again, well, they've closed the highway off again, Highway 1.
Okay.
And so, as you're probably aware, a variety of other highways in BC have been closed. There's been mudslides. And I mean, in terms of the people affected in Abbotsford, it's probably explicitly more people just in the flats. But the larger implication actually is for more transportation and the issues of structure, how you move things from place to place. But in the flats, it's really been just a real tragedy. It's like a lake down there.
You're on your house is on higher ground?
Yeah, most people in Abbotsford are on higher ground. It's just the old lake, the old Sumas lake.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but yeah, most people, I would say it's, well, Taylor lives down there. He's had to evacuate, but he said there's about just about 1,000 live down in the Sumas Flats. And so that's a very small percentage of Abbotsford. But still, it's certainly not a pleasant time to be living through. As I think I told you, the Krakens have been released, as have the Furies, and it's how we cage these creatures.
Yeah, I know. I've been thinking about you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So to begin, you suggested that there's not so much difference between the churchmen of the 50s and 60s and the critical intellectual of the 70s and 80s. And I think that's actually a pretty good starting point to discuss deschooling society, because if you were to think that Illich imparted all sorts of new ideas to me at the end of his life that are in the Rivers North of the Future, it could be a shock to go back and reread Deschooling Society and find out how explicit the comparison of church, the continual comparison of church and school is, and how important the identification of schooling as a liturgy is to his understanding, or a mythopoetic ritual, he also says. So I think a lot of the ideas that he will, it is kind of the book for him, I think. Things that I would want to point out about it, given that you've all read the chapters, is that it's clearly, schooling is clearly has a real existence for him. That is, he is absolutely interested in the mechanism, the repetition, the way in which the slow drip, drip, drip of the day-to-day forms the individual who's subject to it, and forms that individual in a way reminiscent of Illich's "the medium is McLuhan's "the medium is the message," so that it's the form, the repetition that is actually affecting one. But he also clearly thinks of it as a metaphor when he says that deschooling will be at the root of any movement for human liberation. To say that's the most important, why is it the most important? Well, it stands for something. It stands for the schooling of the imagination, which is obviously being carried on by many agencies all the time. So it clearly has a significance beyond what it immediately is. The third thing that I always want to point out to people, and I'm sure you've all grasped this perfectly well, is that he was not understood at the time as making a constitutional proposal. And why would be an interesting question, because it was the most commented of all his books. A man who knew him, whose name I'm not remembering right now, and I mentioned this in the book, did a bibliography and found something like 800 articles or reviews or critical discussions, some of them at book length, that were devoted to that, but they almost all treated it as if it were either a form of madness, some sort of utopian, wild thinking, or that it was a proposal for the reform of education. And what he actually said was that schools are a perfectly practical arrangement for imparting knowledge under certain circumstances, and he's certainly not against anyone setting one up to accomplish some delimited aim, and he did so himself or with his colleagues at CDOC, where they had an excellent language school which operated according to very standard drill repetition principles. But what he was calling for was disestablishment, which again relates back. I mean, there again you see the church metaphor is primary, that no privilege should be associated with people who wish to undertake for some limited purpose this procedure. So I think that was never really understood, and I think it remains therefore a constitutional issue, although education has so far overspilled its banks, as to use a current image, that it's very hard to pin it down. And in fact, Illich himself, as he relates in Illich in Conversation, began to see, even before his book was published, that he was wrong to think that the school was as important as he was making it. That now you're lucky if your friends are not constantly educating you in their discourse with you, because the idea of continuing education, of in-service education, of anti-racism training, whatever it may be that you currently stand in need of, just permeates life. And so that's about all I really have to say about deschooling to begin with. The second chapter in the second book under discussion is tools for conviviality, and there I was asked an interesting question by Taylor and also several by Ron. Taylor's question was, how do Grant and Illich relate to one another? Now, I'm thinking that in this group, there are quite a few people who know George Grant, at least somewhat. Maybe not all, so I don't quite know how to deal with that. But I think to make a stab at an answer of Taylor's question is that Illich is pretty practical. And it shows even in avoiding the word technology and using the simpler word tools, which he can also use in the plural. So he avoids the idea of an intimidating ensemble. But also he can propose practical thoughts about this great thing. And I think that's really where the difference may lie, is that he's actually suggesting, first of all, the technology can be put on a scale at which you can theoretically find a point at which a tool exceeds the possibility of control. So that's the great, I mean, that's his great addition. He's not the only one who does it, to thinking about this, is to say that ownership of the means of production, as the Marxists had talked about, is beside the point. If a tool is too big to be controlled, it effectively is not owned by anyone, but rather it owns us. And he argues that there is an identifiable point, although it's always a relative point. It's relative to a certain social scale or to a certain purpose and so on. He never says that you'll be able to find a precise mathematical value, which is the point at which a tool becomes counterproductive or begins to be too good for its own, begin to be too big. But he does, and that runs through the book, through the idea of balances, multiple balances. Always it's attempting to find the point at which you have enough of one, enough of the other. So that was a question that Ron had raised in the middle of a flood, and where many people locally are disoriented, and many you need the state, right? I think that was in essence your question, Ron. Yeah. So, but Illich doesn't, I think, fetishize the local or the convivial. He's always about the idea of a balance, right? And since the balance is effectively lost, since there is no balance, but only one giant sphere of the state and the professional with a kind of fugitive local remainders, it can seem perhaps that he's overemphasizing that, but I think it's always about finding the point of balance. And so I think that's an important point about tools for conviviality. And whether it really, Taylor, I don't know if you're there, but whether that really helps with understanding. I think these are not things that George Grant fails to understand, but I'm taking him as somewhat a follower of Heidegger in the sense that he defers to Heidegger on this point. So I think Illich is proceeding slightly differently. And so again, this practical side, this limited side, and that I think is evident. And the only thing I really want to say about the third chapter and the third book, although Disabling Professions is named after what was also a book, but of which Ivan wrote the lead essay. But I believe that chapter is mainly taken up with medical nemesis. Again, is the political character of what he thought and constitutional character of what he thought he was doing. So he believed, I think, that the whole formal structure of modern democracies, whether they're explicitly a balance of powers, separation of powers, as in the American Constitution, or whether some of it is more implicit, as in the British Constitution. In all cases, they're believed to be counteracting powers. And the real power that has emerged, which for Illich is professional power in the broadest sense, has no standing, and nearly no standing within that constitution, but in fact has virtually overcome it and eclipsed it. So the effective powers in our world are not even recognized as political powers. They're forms of expertise, forms of tutelage that don't even get recognized. And so I've always felt that he's asking for a recognition of that political character. And that becomes very, very explicit in Medical Nemesis. And that's a book that was already striking for me to reread before the pandemic, and I bet it would be even more striking now to reread it, because he insists that doctors possess their authority and their power by political delegation. That is, that these are always political matters. Who has the right to declare themselves sick, what is considered to be a sickness, and so on, are all there. These are not objective scientific matters, although they are made into objective scientific matters, and thereby hangs a tale. But that he considers them political in the very biggest, largest sense of that word. And I think that's very striking at the moment, because obviously all this emergency power that has been seized, that presumably will be held unless sterner resistance is put up than is evident now, all of this is claimed on the basis of emergency, of science, of expert knowledge. And he is one of the people who has the courage to contest that in principle. He may contest individual claims on their own ground, but he contests it in general, right? So he stands for practical judgment. And I don't know a better expression than that people must be able to form their own rough and ready judgments from their knowledge of their own circumstances. And that power is eclipsed and denied by professional power. You are not capable of making those decisions. You don't have the knowledge which would be necessary to make them. And so that's I think the very important part of disabling professions. Now, a couple of other questions. Ron asked several, and now the questions that were asked, Wayne sent me a whole bunch of questions just today, which I probably haven't really absorbed yet, which concern that's good. Which concerned deschooling society, and as I understood them, seemed to say, one, isn't this a very isn't this schooling structure where there's competition and comparison and ranking of all these kinds, isn't this a very Girardian structure? I think the answer is yes. It certainly is. And another question seems to be, don't human beings do this innately? And therefore, if they didn't do it in the form of a school, wouldn't they probably, Wayne didn't say this, wouldn't they probably just do it in some other form? And I think the answer to that is probably also yes. But the school is a real thing and makes it much worse. You wouldn't have a society that's so strongly peer-oriented if it weren't for schooling. So you would have much more of a balance between generations. The children would grow into a world which they would have to understand as such, rather than through schooling. The school becomes the world. It takes up so much of their time, and in effect is the world. And it's a very much a peer-oriented world. So I think he's not, and I don't think he was ever an idealist in the utopian sense of idealist. So I think Wayne, and I'm not sure I'm understanding well what you wrote. And then the third thing is that I've put a lot of emphasis in my book on schooling, but not just schooling as a hidden, if you like, or buried liturgy. That is when people renounce formally Christianity, they think, well, I don't do that anymore. I'm not a believer. I don't go to church. They still live in a society that's structured as a church. It's structured after the church in a certain way. And is it worse for them that they don't even recognize it? Does it become a more powerful, unconscious structure by not being recognized and by the form of it not even being known? You think that's all over now, so it grips you ever more tightly. And Wayne, I think, asked the question, well, aren't people, is this really true, or aren't people willfully deceived? Isn't it a willful blindness that prevents us from looking the character of our world in the eye? And you can, Wayne, you can correct that, but I think that's a very strong point. But I think that things can become unconscious. We can deceive ourselves about the nature of what we're dealing with. And to the extent that it becomes implicit, I think it does become easier to hide from yourself. I think it becomes the astonishing belief of the contemporary young, and it began with me when I was young, and many of you can say the same. The astonishing belief in our own righteousness and our own goodness. It must have come from somewhere. It certainly greatly exceeded any such conviction even in my parents' generation, and certainly in my grandparents. And yet we thought they were the ones. And now, I mean, you know, the contempt we have for our ancestors is astonishing. But licensed contempt. So everybody can go and piss on Egerton Ryerson's statue and feel like they've just done the best thing in the world. You know, what a benighted old geezer he was, and so on and so on and so on. So again, I think there is willful blindness, but it's not a constant quantity. It may change. So Ron had one more, which is really deep, which is the relationship between remedium in Hugh of St. Victor and vernacular, and also one about whether Illich thinks of vernacular in the same way that you would say Burke thought about the small platoons or the parish, as it was in English-speaking countries. So I don't know whether to pursue those questions right now or try to work them in later. I think the vernacular is covered more thoroughly in the next chapter, which is called Certainties, which we'll talk about next time. So, and similarly, Hugh's idea of, well, I guess that's introduced at the end of the Illich's Revolutionary chapter, isn't it? Ron, is that correct?
Yes, you do. Yeah, you do introduce
Yeah.
Hugh.
Okay,
and
so let's.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk about it for a minute. Illich was inspired by Hugh of St. Victor, who was a 12th century monk and latterly abbot of a new kind of monastery on the outskirts of Paris. Today it'd be right in the heart of the left bank. And Hugh, according to Illich, and you can find it in Hugh, had the idea that a standard for what is suitable or fitting in technology is that it's a remedy for our fallen condition. You know, we're suited for paradise, no thorns, no scales, no horns, no fur. So we need to take care of our disabilities in that sense, and that technology is a remedy for our condition. And Illich, I think, found that inspiring because it seemed to be a principle that had a limit to it, that was in effect equivalent to what I sometimes call enoughness. But what has it to do with vernacular, which was Illich's word, which he hoped to put into common use for whatever is homemade within local grasp, within local control, outside of, although it might use money, outside of a predominantly commercial motivation. And I think, I don't quite understand the question, perhaps, Ron, but I think they are related to each other in the sense that you know, it would be within a local setting in which self-sufficiency meant anything, that the idea of remedy would perhaps be explored and discovered. So I don't know. On the question of whether he has a kind of Burkean conception, I think he's more influenced by the milieu in which he spent his first years in Dalmatia and old Europe in that sense. But clearly he's talking about something like that. But I think that there's a very strong accent of a new circumstance in conviviality. And if you look in the essays in Shadow Work, there's great admiration for institutions that are being created, whether it's lending libraries in southern India or it's hippies in North America. He very much sees subsistence as a new creation, his idea of subsistence as a new creation, governed by a certain knowledge of the past and a certain understanding of the past. But but radically new. So I don't know if that answers any of your questions satisfactorily, but perhaps we should just open the floor now. Mr. Chairman, over to you.
Yes, indeed. I'll follow David's lead on that. So I know some of you have sent David questions and others of you may not have. So for those perhaps who have not, why don't you toss the ball David's way and see how he hits it and where the ball goes.
I can toss a ball, as I think probably a lot of the balls that have come from my corner. It's like in the how then shall we live category. I'm thinking about a conversation I had with fellow marriage and family therapy students this last weekend. After writing my book and discovering that I wasn't just going to make a living as a talking head outside of any kind of university system, I decided I needed to do something, and so I'm training in marriage and family therapy. So the Illich's comment on a world of disabling professions, lurks significantly in the background of my work, and one of the conversations that my colleagues and I seem to often return to is sort of a question of, maybe call it quality control and accountability within that kind of profession, and the profession is at a stage, it's still a fairly young profession, and so it's right now there's a Canadian association that's really just forming, and the emphasis is on standardization, institutionalization. How do we create institutions that will ensure that anyone who carries the brand, it's still an unregistered profession. Anyone can practice at this point, although that's kind of in flux, I think, the way the wind is blowing. But the idea is of trying to have institutions guarantee that people with certain credentials behind their names, have been signed off on as these are good, real, qualified therapists, and kind of separate them, quote, charlatans that are moving around in this Wild West. And we have, as students, we have stories of people kind of outside of the official system. I'm thinking of a friend of mine talks often about someone who he knows who's the wife of a local pastor who's just set up a counseling certificate for herself, and dispensing with help that he at least is pretty critical of. But we're also aware of people moving through the grid of the system who are, schools by their nature, they select for people who are good at managing their way through bureaucracies. And those folks might be good healers and responsible helpers, and they might not be. So I think my question is maybe about accountability at the local convivial scale. What examples or imagination might Illich have for us if we want to think about, okay, if we're going to do accountability well on the local end of things as an alternative to a cultural script that says the only accountability that's real is the accountability that's kind of accredited, certified by large, huge institutions. Either examples from his life or from his thought on that question of how do we do accountability well on the local convivial level?
Well, I'm not sure Illich had a word to say about it, but because he didn't ever see that as his task or his competence. But what you're making me think of is what happened here in Ontario with birth. So
Right.
when I had when we had our children, we were dropouts from the obstetrical system. We had children at home with unlicensed midwives. What made us accountable to each other? How did the midwife know to trust us, that we were telling her everything? How did we know to trust her that she was capable? Well, we knew each other, right? And it was a remarkable period in various respects. First of all, I'll tell a story that Barbara Katz Rothman told me, which was a birth at which the woman at full dilation took a nap before having the baby. Well, that's not going to happen in a hospital, because it's not going to be, and therefore you won't know that it could happen in a hospital. So first of all, that Wild West, as you called it, in which we were then living with some excitement, was a school. We were learning things that and this, one of our great inspirations was a woman called Ina May Gaskin, who was connected to a man called Stephen Gaskin, who became a kind of freelance teacher in San Francisco during the real Wild West of the late 1960s. And eventually about 1,000 souls formed a bus caravan and went searching for a place to settle, and ended up in Tennessee in a place called Summertown. And that's a very long story. But of course, they began to have babies. And so they began to learn, and eventually Ina May published a book called Spiritual Midwifery that told the story. It told birth stories. It also told their experiences. And she eventually became a very experienced and capable midwife, as did many others. And okay, so now it comes to the point in Toronto where there's a death at home,
Right.
And an inquest is held, and a very strong lobby, which has already begun to form. Now's the time we must legalize midwifery. So this was a common opinion. Obviously, it would be better to have a formal rather than an informal profession. Except I didn't agree with that, and my wife Yuta didn't agree with that. And she wrote an essay called The Trouble with Licensing Midwives, which pointed out all the things that would be lost if this did not remain informal. Needless to say, midwifery has been legalized. You can study it at the university, you can go to the College of Midwives, you can have a very, very good career, right? But are the right people becoming midwives? Well, the answer to that is sometimes, but a lot of times not.
This is
A lot
same
of times
answer for
not.
same answer for marriage and family therapy. Yep.
Yeah, and for doctors. So I don't think there's an answer to your question, but I mean, if it gets around that there's a technique for marriage, or there's a technique for grieving, or there's a technique which somebody else knows better than you, then something's going to be lost as well as gained. And you have to try and honestly register the loss, even as you can't. You know, my daughter-in-law is training as a midwife. Well, what else is she going to do, right? She can't. The world that we had, which is one of my definitions of conviviality, we gave up. There were almost no others except you and I who argued against it, who believed that it was even possible to keep it informal, or that there would be any gain in keeping it informal. And yeah, so I don't know. That answers you with a story rather than. But I think that whatever. Okay, so another reference. Nils Christie was a Norwegian criminologist and a very dear friend of Ivan's. They loved each other. And in 1976, Nils published an essay in the British Journal of Criminology called Conflicts as Property. Right? So it's a study of all the ways in which the sinews of community waste away and die and are believed to no longer exist, like the capacity to have a nap at full dilation, when the state reaches in and, I mean, to take an insane example, which happened here, a young man whom I knew, whom my children knew, was murdered at the end of our street. This is 40 years ago, 30 anyway. We couldn't find out a thing about it.
Right.
Not a thing. We had no right to know anything about it. That privacy, it belonged entirely to the agencies who took it over, and we never did find out anything about it. Now, we didn't know this guy's family. You know, I don't want to exaggerate. We were connected to this guy through the park. We didn't know a lot of his background. We presumably could have found out something, but not through it. It's completely removed, taken out, right? So the official agency, state-supported sustenance of marriage, let's say, right, is relative to the vernacular sustenance of marriage. They're not two separate things. You know that, right? So the ability the ability to apply to the right people won't occur if the wrong people are there and in such numbers that the right people no longer exist or don't exercise their vocation. So I don't see, what am I trying to say? I don't see how you can do without wildness. Right?
Without wildness.
You called it wildness, and I liked your image, Wild West.
Yeah.
Right? I think Ivan was ready for, I mean, the Wild West is kind of a bit of a Hollywood thing, right? And we hope everybody's not armed and ready to shoot at the slightest insult. But there must be implicit in Illich's ideas a right to sin. It's kind of a stupid, I don't know if that's a good or bad way of putting it. A right.
Well, Luther said, "Sin boldly."
Sin boldly, but to make mistakes, right? To not do it in the best possible way. I mean, now the claim of the Marriage and Family Counselors Association or of any other state enterprise will be that we have canons of excellence. We do it in the best possible way. But it may be that sometimes they do it in a better way. I think it can't be argued on some romantic ground that what Illich calls vernacular, or what happened in our little world in Toronto before midwives were licensed, and where people, and where you'd have compensated our midwife by doing childcare at her clinic. So there was a lot of barter involved. There was a lot of mutual support. There was a lot of informal stuff. That isn't always going to be the best way, but it's going to be the human way. It's going to provide pathways to learn. It's going to allow vocations to emerge. So I don't know. I think the biggest question is, does the formal system, what does the formal system hide? What does it disable? What does it eclipse? And what does it allow to fall into disuse? And then eventually the belief that it doesn't exist at all, which is, something that was amazing to me is we didn't send the children to school either. So the most common remark that was made to me during that period was, what about socialization? Like, nobody seemed to be under any illusions about the curriculum, right? That they couldn't drop into school any time and catch up. That doesn't seem to surprise anybody. But they couldn't. They didn't believe they would be properly socialized, which is kind of amazing in a way. No, probably that you would. Now, I always thought, well, they really don't believe that people are social then. Well, they don't think people are innately social. You have to actually go to school to be socialized. That you don't watch and follow and learn and dance mimetically with everything in your environment. But of course, it's not saying socialized in that sense. It's saying they won't be socialized the right way, right? They won't have the right reverences, which turned out not to be true either. So.
Okay, I was going to say, first of all, thanks, Marcus, for the question, and David for your fine, thoughtful
Long story.
answer. A good story, a fine story. But anyone else questions that you'd like to ask David from our readings for today?
Well, I have a question, but it's not really on the readings. I love this section of your book, by the way. I thought it was really well done and clarified things about Illich that I had never clarified for myself. So thank you. But this is the question, and that is, you knew Illich.
Yes.
And so what was his attitude toward his ideas? Was he like a man on a mission, or was he a kind of more of an intellectual skeptic? Guys, I can't imagine the person that had these ideas living in the world without living in it with a particular well, for example, I've met some really committed teachers who believe that the whole educational system has gone wrong, and they've invented alternative structures for how to teach within the system. And whenever I've met them and I've talked to them, they have been, proselytizing and trying to get me on their mission. And I sympathize with their intentions and their ideas, but Illich doesn't seem that kind of a guy. He seems like a very fluid thinker and very capable of imagining counter arguments to all his ideas. what was he like that way?
That's an interesting question. I think this is mentioned at the beginning of the book, but I think he knew pretty early on that he had a remarkable effect on other people, that it could potentially be a destructive effect. He knew that people would follow him, perhaps, that he would have perhaps more influence on them than he wanted to have or felt he could responsibly exercise. So I think probably a habit of veiling his power developed pretty early on. I think he had extraordinary gifts. I think those were evident fairly early on too, and certainly they were evident in Rome by the time he was at the Gregorian. And so I think there must always be a temptation of pride in such superb gifts. And I think he probably was always in some ways humble, but became much humbler as he grew older. Humble sounds wrong in English, but practiced humility, let's say. So I think he was genuinely a man. He was genuinely what he said he was, which was a man who liked to be surprised, wanted to be surprised, considered the messianic, considered the incarnation to be a surprise. And therefore, when he got to New York in 1951, he didn't have a plan. He didn't go there on a mission. You use the term mission. He went to some friends of his grandfather's house the first night he was in town and heard about these Puerto Ricans that everyone was worried about. Like, people are taking over, right? Even the old black cook, he said, was saying, "Oh, these people are moving into Harlem." And he went up to the barrio the next day and got interested. And so, I mean, he became the champion of the Puerto Ricans in the New York church. He literally, I think, probably substantially transformed the situation on the ground, which culminated in this great San Juan fiesta at Fordham in 1955. But he didn't intend to do it. So he was engaged by it, and he followed that, right? And that road led a long way deep into the 60s and into the whole resistance to the missionary enterprise of the church and so on. But I think they were all discoveries. They were all vocations that he found on the way. So when he got to Puerto Rico in 56 and met Everett Reimer and started to find out about the school system, he was on the board of education because he was vice rector of the university. He said he'd never given a moment's thought to schooling. He considered it as something possibly good for others. And I think the whole religious smell of it, if you want, right? The whole sense of it as a liturgy, he found it out. He looked into it. He felt it out. He tried to, and he understood it that way. It was the only way he could understand it. It was obviously to him a counterproductive enterprise. It was obviously demoralizing for the people who were for whom this system was being built up, and then they were being thrown out of it in effect after 3 or 4 grades or whatever it was. So he saw that it was a system for producing dropouts, not a necessarily an equitable or efficient way of distributing resources such as they are. So again, it's a discovery, right? And then he goes on with that. He writes The Futility of Schooling in Latin America. So I think he was always on an adventure. He liked adventure. He liked surprise. And he was always interested in the next discovery. So, I mean, a huge number of people came through CDOC, and he was interested in all of them. And again, trying to feel his way into it. What is cybernetics? What is this? What is that? So that's, I think, how it all went down. He was a teacher. He did love, well, let's say he loved Puerto Rican Catholicism, right? He went into when he got to know these Puerto Ricans, then he wanted to go and see, and he went to Puerto Rico and, hitched around or rode around on a horseback or whatever it was, and found these rural chapels and saw how different it was, right? And then imagine these people in these fortress churches in frigid New York. And, it was all, again, a discovery. He wanted to speak for them. And I think he had the same feeling when he walked through Latin America in the 60s, before they started CDOC in Cuernavaca. He did a kind of pilgrimage, a walk from, I don't know, somewhere near Santiago to Caracas. I don't think he necessarily walked all the way, but he more or less did it by the seat of his pants. And he loved some of what he saw, right? He wanted to protect it. He wanted to not have it be taken over by American priests who were so sure that they knew the better way, and they would build the school, and they would do this, and they would do that. So always, I think, I think everything was governed by a call. And a call was always something limited by the very terms of the call, right? That he wasn't going to become an educational theorist, that he wasn't going to become any kind of a theorist. He was going to write to this occasion and then go on to the next thing. Does that answer a bit?
Yeah, I think, tell me if this is a fair way of characterizing him. I think what you're describing is an organic intellectual that we don't have anymore. We have credentialed people, and we have, what's the term, public intellectuals who are kind of credentialed politicians, maybe. And Illich seems like an organic intellectual in the sense that he thought about the things that were revealed to him and shown to him through his experience, and used his background and his knowledge the best he could to explain those things and answer what you say, the call of the situation. Which,
yeah, I think that's true. I think you can't, I mean, the answer that he gave when Romano Prodi said, this was when Prodi was the Prime Minister of Italy, and this is sometime in the 90s. And Prodi said, isn't what you just said, I was after a lecture, a continuation of prophecy for our time. And Illich said, no, it's not prophecy, it's friendship, right? The office, the space that is occupied in your mind by the idea of prophecy perhaps should be thought of as in terms of friendship. That prophecy ends with the incarnation, except he insists that the prophets that are retained in the New Testament, which I think is an unorthodox, perhaps imaginative reading, are there to denounce the danger that has entered the world with the incarnation, Antichrist. But he insists that the word is present among us. It's there. It's with us. It's between us. And so I think that strongly limits his desire to negative tasks, prescriptive tasks, to denounce what might get in the way of the experience of God with us. Yeah, so the clearing away of obstacles, to unobstruct hearing, are all, I think the tasks are all negative in that sense. There's almost never an answer to the questions one is asked about what did Illich think about X, or what did Illich think about Y, or, well, he was interested in what you thought about it, but, not to be under the illusion, the illusions that come with packaged salvation. And so, yeah, he was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
He was a lot of fun. He was a lover. Yeah, and he liked lively scenes. So there was always kind of a happening around Ivan, and things were always going wrong too, right? That power that he thought he could veil, of course he couldn't veil, right? And people would get disoriented, and young women would fall in love with him, and whatever it was, right? There were all these distortions that go with any social situation. And his enthusiasm often carried him away. But that was the beautiful thing about him.
It sounds like it was impossible for him not to see through the certainties, that he just had a natural X-ray vision through the culture that he was.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, obviously I put my trust in him, and I haven't put my trust in that many people, in the sense that I thought he was, yes, I thought he was clairvoyant. I thought he was clear seeing. And I mean, clairvoyance doesn't have to be an extrasensory power, right, but it was certainly a power of looking at something, and in a multi-sensory way, because it was tactile, it was olfactory, it was intellectual also. I mean, I think our word intellect doesn't quite convey what one would want to convey, although maybe the old medieval intellectus would come closer. I don't know, but yes, but he wasn't. I mean, if you think he wasn't if you would say he wasn't an intellectual, that would be even more deceiving. He was definitely an intellectual. He was a thinker, but it operated in different registers. And later in his life, I mean, the thing that interested him so much was what he called the inner senses, right? The senses of the heart, and which he lectured a lot about, and didn't really produce that much published work except the 2 long essays on the gaze, one of which I've summarized one of them in The Rivers North of the Future, and they're both available online. Guarding the Eye in the Age of the Show, one is called, and I can't remember what the other one's called, but yeah, so that it didn't produce a lot of published work otherwise, but
that helps a lot. Yeah.
Okay.
I was wondering, I know probably Catherine is quite pregnant with questions, as I'm sure Hugh may be, and others. So anyone else have questions for David?
Catherine, you've been making a few comments, so it'd be good to on the chat. So.
Yeah, I was just drawn to the metaphor of wildness. I've had this thing growing inside of me of concern over how Christians have taken the Genesis story and thought of the garden as being spread out over the whole of the planet, and our notions of gardening have radically changed, and how in terms of an interested in eco-criticism, I've been reading a little bit of Vandana Shiva, and this is reminding me, I'm just going to put this in the chat. It's reminding me of what she's taken up as an act of resistance against Gates and other corporations buying up seed banks. And one of the things that she says in this article I was just reading is that what they are doing is genetic colonialism. And I can't help but think that the same thing is the case, which Illich so beautifully saw clearly and articulated about medicine and the capability of healing and enduring suffering and meeting our own death, that is a kind of colonialism. And I just wonder if he was sensitive to all of these imperial colonial moves, not because of religion per se, but his encounter with the Inquisition, you know, his own encounter with the inquisitory control over his thought and his actions made him astutely aware of what was going on in the age of system that was covering all aspects of life. As religion becomes like the Nova effect that Charles Taylor says, as it becomes dispersed in all of these different aspects of life, he just had that same feel that Vandana Shiva has of resisting the robbing of the farmer of their knowledge, their evolutionary history, their link to the conditions of their place, and their wisdom, and how that applies to health as well. So those are the things that are
Yeah, well, that's
percolating.
certainly the answer. The short answer is absolutely yes. I think probably by the time he got to Rome in '68, this was already a fully formed understanding, right? His writings on mission, beginning in the 50s and continuing through the early 60s, are very much already have this idea of how can the cultural trappings of Christianity be allowed to fall away, right? And how do you know what form the word will take in another cultural setting, was the question he kept asking himself, right? And so you don't, and of course the answer is you don't until you allowed it to actually, until you have learned silence, till you have, you know, there's an essay on language learning that was reproduced in Celebration of Awareness, in which he says that you know, the experience of learning another language, of being dumb before other people, is a great experience. You know, that one, in effect, one can learn the right attitude towards God in that experience, right? To understand that one is dumb, to understand distance, to gain respect by learning to listen. So yes, I think he had that somehow, was very much part of him from the outset. But I think the idea of wildness has always been beloved by me, because I don't think it's been trademarked yet. So probably we should shut up about it. But
okay, we'll nix this recording. Get rid of it.
Gary Snyder has made a lot, has written quite a bit about wildness.
He has, but always in his wonderful way. Not. I hope he doesn't give wildness workshops yet. Yeah, you know, I don't know. I think a great idea here is, you know, he has an essay that I pondered for a long time. it's in shadow work. It's called Vernacular Values. And he seems to be taking a Spanish grammarian called Antonio Nebrija to task for codifying the Castilian language. He makes a lot of the scene where Nebrija accosts the queen and says, you know, I have a project even more glorious than Columbus's journey, which will be to create a grammar of the Castilian tongue. And the queen can't quite see the point because she thinks, well, my subjects are perfectly able to control their own tongues. Why do they need you? But when I thought about it, Nebrija represented so many things that I reverenced. You know, I hadn't known anything about Nebrija, but if you turn it into Joachim du Bellay or Erasmus or Spencer or whoever it may be in England, right? This is a great humanist, right? Who wants to create a grammar. Well, Illich was a great grammarian. What's he got against grammar exactly, right? So I think you have to see that he's got this method of looking where finding parables, finding origin stories where you can see something just beginning to appear. And it's not that he's against grammar. It's not that he's against humanism. It's that he wants to know, well, what would have happened if Nebrija and his ilk hadn't? You know, Nebrija was tremendously worried about the flood of vernacular literatures that was coursing over Europe after the invention of the printing press, right? These were all, I mean, the people were, it's a little bit like now with the internet in a certain way, right? And Nebrija wants to put a lid on it, like let's get this thing back under control. So there is in him that predilection for wildness, right? So he would not be one of the ones today who's saying, we've got to write protocols for the internet. We've got to make sure people have corrected, you know, this attempt to clamp down. We're going to stop misinformation, right? And so on. That's not his spirit at all. Wow.
So it's a good Samaritan story in certain ways is kind of for him then an original wildness, right? Back to that idea.
I think so. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's that you hear what you hear the call.
Could I ask a quick question then? David, you know well the restorative justice movement and its beginnings here in Canada, and it's spread worldwide, and you wrote an outstanding book on it, The Expanding Prison. But I happened to be on the ground in the mid-70s when that first emerged in Elmira, Ontario, the first so-called case of restorative justice under an established jurisdiction. Anyway, very early on, this idea began to echo further and further. And so very early on, there was this discussion amongst a number of us around two things. One was, well, then we have to define it. And there was a whole conference, the first one ever on restorative justice, that in part tried to do that down in Washington, D.C., and a couple of us from Canada attended, unsuccessfully, I should say. And the other was to try to contain its replication, which you could say differently, try to institutionalize what really was a spontaneous act. Two guys who had done vandalism, and a couple of Mennonites get this idea, well, wouldn't it be good if they met their victims, you know? And so I was part of those discussions. Is we somehow wanted to control almost from the start where it would spread or how it would be picked up. And I think what I'm gathering is it was hopeless in this case anyway. There's no way you could control it. And in a way, Illich would have probably asked if he had been part of one of those discussions, well, why do you? I mean, it's going to either replicate well some of your ideals, or it won't, but that's life kind of thing. Would that be along those lines?
I think so. Yeah, I imagine the restorative justice story would be not unlike the midwifery story, right?
Yeah.
In that the spiritual and intellectual resources to resist don't seem to have been there yet, right? I mean, I think you'll remember this, but at the end of the very end of this book, The Expanding Prison, which was inspired by you and a lot of other people, and primarily by Nils Christie, I tried to say, I've told a lot of stories. I don't think any of those stories constitute a reproducible blueprint, right? This is what some people were inspired to do. Well, I mean, I think again, there's balance comes in, right? You can't say, well, don't call it a circle of support, because then someone who's not inspired will try and do a circle of support and it won't work out, and then there'll be a whole, no, it obviously we speak, then we speak again, and if we like the way we've spoken, we may take that formula and keep using it, right? We develop forms. I mean, all cultures are forms. Right? I think it could be carried to a ridiculous extent of a kind of programmatic anarchism, which would be purely destructive.
Yeah.
But it's always the feel for the point of balance. But the feel can't be there, I don't think, unless the trust is there, right?
Mm-hmm.
The trust that inspiration will be available, will come, right? It won't come on demand, but it will come if we call, it will come if we wait, it will be there. And so, yeah. So not the Inquisitor's position that it's not going to happen unless we do it.
Yeah.
And so that, I mean, I've been put through a couple of painful restorative justice sessions, right, which were strictly paint by numbers, right, by somebody who was a professional and they knew how to do it. That's how we're going to do it. So yeah, it's always a question of feel. It's always a question of trust, I think. And it seems to me anyway that this complementarity idea, that if you see there's always a complementary domain, if you understand that everything you undertake has a shadow, there's a better chance of finding where the point of balance is.
A quick final comment then on that. Jacques Ellul somewhere said, the moment that you achieve what you're trying to do politically is the moment you start deconstructing what you've just built. Something to that effect.
Yeah. Lao Tzu says, conduct your triumph as a funeral.
That's wonderful.
What's a favorite of mine, right?
Oh, wow.
You can't. So somewhere in the middle of life's journey, I began to think that my philosophy of life was you can't win.
Mm-hmm.
And that's doesn't sound like much of a philosophy, but it's held up pretty well. So you can't win.
Who said construct your triumph as a funeral? Who said that?
It's in the Tao Te Ching. It's in the Way of Life. Lao Tzu,
okay, yeah.
Legendary Lao Tzu.
Yes.
One of the later stanzas. I'll send it to you. It's a favorite.
If you can, that'd be great, David.
Yeah.
I'll look for it too. Thank you.
I was thinking the same thing, Wayne, about kind of the professionalization of restorative justice. And in many ways that dynamic is working itself out, I think, in the COSA network these days in Canada, right?
Now too. Yeah.
Something that started, and I was struck by your your comments on prophecy and friendship, David, right? And how did I wrote it down, but the prophecy ends with the incarnation. But what I heard from you is the space of prophecy is occupied in today's world by friendship. Is that accurate?
Well, that's what I said. Yeah.
Yeah. So the genesis of the work of Circles of Support and Accountability was that of befriending people who were marginalized, right?
Yeah.
And I think
You were there, Hugh.
I think that was the genius of it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we just kind of fell into it, but that was the genius of it. And so the dynamics presently are very much sort of codifying that and resistant to the concept of friendship, right? Friendship doesn't, you can't have friendship because it's really about public safety and that kind of thing, so it's I think that in a similar kind of way, you can argue that circles of support and accountability are a victim of their own success, right?
Yeah, as restorative justice of a kind was too.
Well, exactly. And there's even a company now, that outfit in Philadelphia, what's it called? The International Institute for Restorative Justice. So they, it's a business, right? And they've protected certain terms like restorative practice, right? Is protected language, right? You can't use that term anymore because it's been copyrighted, and so you get these kinds of dynamics, right? With this move towards professionalization and codifying of things that were really wild, right? And
to be sure,
and spontaneous and kind of inspired and maybe of the spirit, right? So anyway,
optimi pessima.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It comes back to Illich's mantra in many ways.
Right. And I definitely do not see him as because I think people wonder about this, right? Was he some kind of idealist who thought that there wouldn't be institutions in the world, right? And so again, it always has to be brought back to this moving point of balance, this scale issue, the feel for the situation, and the sense of sin, right? Which he claims in a certain way is lost to Christians by its criminalization in the 12th century, by its codification, if you like. So he wants to restore the glorious side of the sense of sin, right? That the joy of being wrong, as James Allison called his wonderful theology book, which was so enlightening for me.
On Girard, yeah.
It's a Girardian book, but it's totally illuminated Illich for me. I understood so much more when I read that book. It's a great book.
Wow. I've read it, but I have to go back and read it in that light.
Well, just the title. I mean, the joy of being wrong, right?
Yeah.
That we,
Well, that he says in that book that idea of it, and that's original sin, he says, is a post-resurrection idea by the early Christians, which I've always found fascinating.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what Ivan says too, right?
Catherine, you had a question?
Oh, I was just going to say, I see in my notebook that I had Felix Culpa Day on November the 3rd. A friend and I were exchanging an email, and he was talking about how the bureaucracy eventually caves in on itself. And to me, that was so consoling that blessed be the folly and the failures that come at last in the building of the Babel. it may be our only hope.
I believe it is our only hope. Yeah.
Like the clowns showing up at the festivals and all those kinds of things, eh? Yeah.
Yeah,
Except
well, that,
these
I know. I
ones-
think I
these
told
ones-
that wonderful story in the book that of what's it called, the Strauss opera, where they have to play the tragedy and the comedy at the same time in the end.
Oh, right. Yes.
Not Iphigenia and Talus. What's it called? Anyway, it's
I'll look in your
doesn't-
index.
It doesn't matter.
The great hope is that the clowns don't know that they're clowns. They think that they are the experts, and
Yeah.
we just wait. We just wait with hope.
I'm reminded of the fall of the Berlin Wall, precipitated by a badly read announcement by a mid-level bureaucrat.
Ah,
Yeah.
Well, I don't. This is not concerning Illich, but I yesterday read the paper that I was discussing with Jens, written by Bruce Hindmarsh, which I do think is a very extraordinary and exemplary piece of work, but it's very hard to face it, right? Because it's hard to avoid seeing the totalitarian dimension in what's going on, right? To feel that the world has really withdrawn or been withdrawn. That so many people have turned their backs. That so many have that the world really has, in a certain sense, disappeared. I mean, it isn't true. The world is there as just as it was before, but it can feel like that at times, right? That the openness of things has suddenly closed. So yeah, it's a challenging time.
Could you comment a little more, David, on the section on disabling professions about, is it iatrogenesis or iotogenesis?
Iatrogenesis.
What you say about death losing significance as something that belongs to me. This feels like maybe every generation feels this way, that the fear of death is behind so much of our impulses technologically. But it feels to me like it's at the very center of the age of system. Am I reading that Illich also did? Am I reading rightly? Am I resonating with Illich when I detect that the fear of death, rather than the pursuit of the fullness of life, becomes the central impetus in the age of system?
No, you're completely right. This was a central idea for him in the Powerless Church, which is a collection of early essays, mainly early essays, that was republished by the Penn State Press a couple of years ago. It's the first book in the same series in which mine appears. There's an essay written in the early 50s called Rehearsal for Death. No, wait a minute. Maybe that's the second one. And then there's a longer one written when he was in Puerto Rico. But in the end, I think he always understood that death would be the final surprise, as he says, right? And that he would always try to live in that light. So that I think it was alarming to him. There's a very excellent chapter in Medical Nemesis, which is a kind of history of death. And there's a long discussion of it in the book also. But I think the idea that he reached by the 1990s that and was a terrifying idea to him was what he called amortality, right? Which was something different, I think, than the denial of death, right? It was actually death had, in a real sense, ceased to exist. The whole meaning of mortality had changed, right? So that lives that are managed as systems will end with the end of their viability as systems. And presumably I won't know that, someone else will know it. They'll be able to instruct me or inform me that my system is no longer viable, or maybe they'll even execute me if I wish it, and I meet the criteria. So I think that was terrifying to him in the same way that risk was terrifying to him, right? The idea that I would think of myself as an item of population found somewhere on a risk curve, rather than as someone who is embodied here now, right? I mean, if I have a strong intuition that I don't want this vaccine, what is the status of that? Who cares? You're going to lose your job. You're going to lose your place. You're not going to be welcome anywhere. We don't care. We're trying to. This is about population health, and even if it weren't absurd, even if it made sense to vaccinate children who are at no risk, it would still be ultimately about population health. And I think, population health is an idea that one should probably, at the least you're supping with the devil, you're going to want a long spoon. It may be an idea we can't do without in some ways in the world we live in, but it certainly should be handled with tongs. And instead, it's almost the only idea. It's drummed every moment. So that's another aspect of amortality, right? So yeah, I think it's death has died, as he said, and can only be brought back to life in an exemplary way by our consenting to it, by our consenting to live in a different way.
Would you say that life has died? Like it's the flip of the coin?
Yes, I would say the same is true. I mean, he put it differently, right? He scandalized everybody with this denunciation of life as idle, right? Or scandalized or mystified, because I've told this story before, but when I was amazed when Illich went before a big Lutheran convocation in Chicago in 1989 and said that life was the greatest idol the church had faced in its history. And I was astonished by to read that paper, and I got him to do another interview, and I was going to broadcast that. I thought, oh, this is a real bomb. This is a real bomb. And it was the most completely unnoticed. It was as if I had farted. Everyone was just going to keep quiet about it. Right? It was just amazing to me. And now I think it's a little more out in the open. And I have a long essay on this. It's on my blog because I was taken to task by a couple of European friends for, that this, I'm misappropriating Illich's ideas on life, but I don't think I am. So yes, life dies with death in a certain way. It becomes a resource. It becomes a substantive, as he said. It becomes something to be managed, something to be sustained, something that is not the same as a person.
All of your talk about wildness, all of the talk about wildness has brought that really home to me of how appropriate that metaphor is. That when life loses the wildness, it has become something else. We've changed the subject.
Right. So and its wildness is its givenness also, right? That the wild is not necessarily the crazy wild. It's just what is given beyond our ability to understand. Yeah.
So doctor-assisted suicide would certainly be something that Illich did or would have much to say on.
Well, he does. I mean, there's a wonderful letter which is which you can find online. It's called Posthumous Longevity, and it was an open letter to a community of Benedictine nuns in Connecticut, which he was closely connected. And he begins so it begins, Dear Mother Superior. He knew a lot of these women and had been a regular there. And he mentions the case of a actually was the aunt of an old friend of his, and who had come to him and said that she had chosen the time of her death, and she was and he evinced evident disapproval, and her regard for him was such that she didn't carry out her plan. So the next chapter of the story is that she contacted pneumonia, but the social workers came and broke down the door and saved her. So then he said her spirit was broken and she lived out her life in a condition of what he wanted to call posthumous longevity. So he writes to the nuns saying, this is a matter for consideration. This is that discretion is the mother of the virtues, because no virtue by itself is adequate. Only discretion can govern the virtues. And he says that he doesn't want to speak for suicide, and that he doesn't want to speak for euthanasia, but what are we going to do? And that's really the question he puts in front of them, right? It's clearly wrong for him to empower doctors to execute their patients as their final benediction. He clearly believes suicide to be wrong. He won't assist it in any way. But he's saying, how can friends help one another to die and to find the hour of their death? And I think it's a living question amongst us. So anyway, Catherine, that essay is called Posthumous Longevity. It's a wonderful piece.
She's given us a link.
I have read it and taken much from it. Yes.
Okay, good.
And there is a link.
following your blog led me to it.
Okay. All right, good. Well, that's nice.
Other questions from anyone?
Is Taylor there, or is he not?
No,
No,
we've lost Taylor. And Jens
'Cause
always
he-
has to go early, I think. So
Yeah.
Taylor had to pick up the two girls, and
Okay. I just wondered if he was satisfied at all with my Grant Illich
yeah, oh, I'm
attempt
sure he
early.
was. Yeah,
I
no,
doubt
he
it.
was with you. Yeah, yeah. Just one question for David. You mentioned that Illich lives in balance, and so the balance between liberty and order is a tension, very difficult to live with. And the danger is we can sometimes absolutize order, certain views of education or medicine or development or religion. And then you need liberty to sort of deconstruct that absolutizing, but then liberty can go off in an anarchist direction without order. And I just gave a lecture this week on the vaccine crisis on Sophocles' Antigone, and the tensions between Creon and Antigone on this one. And Erasmus does the same thing, very critical of the Roman Catholic Church, realizing the limitations, the aberrations, the distortions. But unlike Luther, he wouldn't head off in the Protestant direction. He lived in this trying tension. And as a result, he got put on the index from Trent to Vatican II for his honorable living in the tension. But where's Illich on that sort of, because obviously a lot of this stuff, he's critiquing a certain authoritarian imperial nature of order, and legitimately so. But in living in balance and tension, how does he deal with that liberty order tension?
Well, he's certainly with Erasmus. And would have stayed in the church if it had been possible, and probably would have remained a priest had it been possible. I think it was a sincere conclusion on his part that it was going to be worse for the church in the end if he stayed than if he withdrew. Well, he never left the church, of course, but he ceased in any official way to represent it or to perform any of its offices. So I think he's clearly with Erasmus. But I think this all my stories are in this book. That's why it's so long. But a favorite of mine occurred when he came to Toronto to lecture at a teach-in in 1970 called Crisis in Development. And I went out to meet him at the airport in this old banger that I had. And he was really good about all that kind of hippiest touches. But we had the War Measures Act had just been declared. And I was in quite a state about it, as were almost everyone else that I knew, and demonstrating and so on. And I had taken Illich for, I think, probably someone like me, I guess. I don't know, a man of the left, which he partly was. And he shocked me by saying that he completely agreed with what Pierre Trudeau had done in declaring the War Measures Act. And he knew Trudeau. He had spent time with him. He was acquainted with Gerard Pelletier, and whom he had met in Rome. And so he knew him and had spent time with him. But I was amazed to hear that. And it was only years later, really, that I think I realized that I thought it through, and I realized that he foresaw much more dreadful consequences if an excessively violent act was not done then, that much more and worse violence would follow than if it wasn't, even if injustice was done, as manifestly it was. And that's what obsessed me and my friends, that the innocent were arrested and so on. So I think that's the conservative side, the order side, and strongly felt as well. So.
Well, we're dealing right now with all kinds of road closures and stuff like that. But people have to get around. And so, for instance, last night, my wife and I co-facilitate a group of men at the Mennonite Central Committee office who have abused their partners. Well, it takes us normally about 45 minutes to get there. But the reality, and Ron, you've been one to pass this on to me, is that if we just headed up number 11 North and insisted on continuing, quite apart from what the police might do, our car would suddenly sputter and die because it would be in 2 feet of water or whatever it's in right now. And so that whole thing of order and liberty, I guess it's very existential. Is that the right way to think of it? That in the moment almost is what has to be acted on.
I think so. I mean, I think he definitely thought of Pierre Trudeau's action as being of that moment in that situation, not as a rule in any way that one would always follow, right?
Remember Trudeau said,
how much he really knew.
Oh, I just remember Trudeau said, "Try me." When a journalist says, "You're not going to invoke
just
that."
watch me.
Well, just watch me. Just watch me. That's it.
Yeah.
So to play the devil's advocate, and you may want to get out your long spoon. How is that different than this war against a scary virus and all the impositions on human freedom that have come with it?
Well, I guess the main difference is that the virus is we face it as a natural event, even if it didn't have a natural origin, which is, I think, more likely than not at this point. But it once got out of that lab, if it did get out of that lab, it's a coronavirus. It's whether it was engineered or not. They engineer themselves. I don't see it as at all the same. And also, I believe that Pierre Trudeau, whatever his faults, took a limited and delimited action. Right? The War Measure Act was withdrawn. The powers that are being accumulated at the moment, I don't see them being willingly, very easily withdrawn. I see this as a power play on a number of fronts, right? So the Trusted News Initiative, which has engulfed the CBC and turned it into something like Pravda. Is that going to be over when the virus is found to be endemic? Will the Trusted News Initiative end? I don't think so. Right? The movement to the World Economic Forum's preferred form of managed capitalism, will that end? I don't think so. The vaccine passports, will they end? Or will they morph into something else? I don't see it. I just don't see it at all as the same. If it were, then I would be much more sympathetic to it. I would, but my view is rooted in the fact that it never was a pandemic. It was only a pandemic because the WHO conveniently changed the definition of pandemic in 2009. Otherwise, no one would have called this a pandemic. And it wouldn't have been treated as an event of the kind which it has been treated as. It couldn't have been built into the nightmare into which it was built. but the majority of the people I have to speak to and interact with think that that's objectively what it is. It's a terrifying worldwide pandemic, which threatens everyone, and that I'm a reckless fool. So pretty crazy. Okay.
Well, we probably need more wild and reckless fools, don't we? Yeah, I guess we're getting near the end here. Just a couple of questions. Are we going to meet again then? I don't think we're to meet in December, are we? Or had we planned
No.
that? No.
We said no. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so it'd be the last
That'd be 2
Tuesday.
days. That'd be 2 days before Christmas, or at the very end of the month again. Anyway, that's fine with me.
I think we just felt that Christmas is time. When we were kind of talking about it all, that probably people are grateful to. There are too many times.
Yeah, that
taken up,
sounds right. That sounds right to me.
Yeah.
And then as to January, the actual Tuesday would be the 25th. I think I'm seeing this okay in the dark here. Would be the next one. And then that all we did as this little committee when we started it was we said, well, let's project 4 of these, David, and you're aware of this, and then we can reassess as a group by that time. And we could reassess it right now and say, well, likely to continue if that's the wish and so on. And I know you've indicated willingness to continue beyond January.
I enjoy hanging with you. And as long as you're satisfied with me, I'm not really preparing that extensively. I mean, just talking freely about the material under consideration.
You've prepared extensively.
So
prepared extensively persons I know.
There's lots of things I wanted. There are lots of things I want to discuss, and they're probably, the farther we go in the book, the more things there'll be that I want to discuss. Gender is a big one.
Yes.
Yeah. Because we're at a kind of watershed there, I think, and I'm a little interested in having having a discussion with some of these, right? And not just what I have to say about it, because I've already had the chance to write at great length about it. So, but yes, so yeah, I'm in principle, let's keep going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, maybe just on that note, David, I would encourage you to feel free if there are to discuss. Oh, have I frozen? I think I froze.
You did for a minute, but I think we heard everything you said.
Yeah, just that if there are topics that you would like to flag for discussion in that way,
that's a good idea. Yeah.
Lovely for you to kind of list those a little bit.
Yeah.
Us anticipate that.
So shall we say then chapters 8 to 10 for the 25th?
Actually, I said 4 to 7, but it's really 4, 5, and 6 is really what we've discussed, Ron. So it'd be chapters 7, 8, and
7,
9.
8, 9.
7, 8, 9. Yeah. Okay. 7, 8, 9.
Good.
For the 25th.
And the only other thing I would add, David, I've sometimes thought, because I know of various others that have obviously talked with you a lot on these, if ever it would seem good to bring another voice in that you would like to do just for that session or something, obviously. In other words, I think an optimal number, I think we would agree, is going to be closer to I'm guessing, 15 people, say, before it gets a bit too many people. And we've been fairly consistently at 10, 11, 12 people. So at 8 right now. But
I have nobody in mind, so at the moment. So.
Yeah.
Okay, well, do have a lovely Advent, Christmas, Epiphany season, and if you have a chance, read T.S. Eliot's Journey of the Magi, a wonderful poem for Epiphany.
And autumn for the time being.
Yeah,
and
God
thank-
bless you all in British Columbia. I'm thinking about
Yes.
you all.
Thank
Catherine,
you.
where are you?
I'm in Tawasin, BC,
Oh, okay, so you're on the island. Oh no, down by
No,
the Twasin's for the
by the
the-
ferry terminal, that's
Yeah.
right.
So is it?
You're on a
did
farm,
you get flooding?
Catherine? Oh, sorry.
I'm not on a farm, but there
Oh.
are farms around us. But it once was an island, I understand, but it's peninsula and it's higher. Where we are is higher,
Okay.
but there are lowlands that are in danger. We've had a little leak in, the basement, but we're handling it. Nothing like the lake.
Okay, good. Anyway, well, bless you all,
Good.
and thank you.
Well, thank
and,
you,
uh,
David,
Thank
for
you.
the generosity of your time and
Yes.
all the
it's-
work you put into the book.
I enjoy this. So,
Wonderful.
all right, see you all in January.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See ya.
Bye-bye. Merry Christmas.
Yeah.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.
Merry